Okay, Google, what's the news?
Here's the latest news.
I'm recording this on February 22nd, 2023, and I'm sitting down to listen to the news as I do pretty much every day nowadays, and I'm hoping that today something finally changes, that today we finally see that video games are popular. See, today's the release of the PSVR 2. It's a headset that I've been looking forward to for a long time, and with it are a bunch of really cool looking games that I'm excited to get my hands on. But the news media doesn't really recognize video games the way that many of us do. We see articles about how video games are corrupting our children's minds. We see articles about how video games are a child's toy for people to enjoy. We see a lot of articles about how video games are making a bunch of people, investors especially, a lot of money. But what about our love for games? What about the art and the passion behind them? Why is it that the rest of the world doesn't see games the way that we do? Why are video games still portrayed as negative influences in the media or just as a child's pastime? Why, after this long, have video games still not found their place among related art forms like movies and music?
Assassin's Creed Valhalla.
And when, if ever, will video games be mainstream?
Video games to me are so much worse since video games
are increasingly likely to be
criminal simulator, murder simulator.
because of violent video games.
I was given my first game console when I was 5 years old. It was a hand-me-down Game Boy. That's Game Boy with a period at the end of it, along with a single game, a copy of Tetris. I grew up in a generation just on the tipping point, where video games were still a hobby for nerds and losers and shut-ins. While the rest of my class was busy playing touch football or our homebrewed version of Off the Wall, I was outside in the shade with my face glued to my Game Boy. During an age where many of your ideas of masculinity and personal identity are formed, when you're testing your areas of interest and disinterest, I typically avoided the traditionally mask activities of playing sports or seeing who could stab a sharp pencil between their fingers the quickest, or competitions to prove whose body was the strongest or the fastest. I played sports after school, but even then, I cared much more about human experiences, about creativity and emotions and stories. And that made me a loser, at least in the eyes of some of the kids on the playground. But video games would whisk me off to new worlds, where problems were solved with critical thinking and with literal magic, where global political struggles would emerge, threaten the planet, and be overcome in a matter of hours, where I could escape reality and cosplay as one of the cool kids who played sports or drove fast cars or beat up strangers. That one still kind of feels bad. Fortunately, though, the social stigma of being a loser who played video games didn't last long, at least not at school. Other kids in class got their hands on their own consoles, and slowly we found birthday parties formerly being held in bowling alleys and laser tag parlors? Where actually is laser tag held? Anyway, we saw these activities replaced with smaller get-togethers around playing video games. It turned out that when my classmates played video games themselves, they saw them less as an activity for nerds and simply another hobby to enjoy alongside everything else that kids love to do. And later on in high school and college, I found that my skills in playing video games were looked on as interesting or impressive by my peers. I was cool before it was cool. Yet, while the stigma around video games among people in our generation faded, it persisted in many people of older generations. There's been a long history of the vilification of video games. We can probably all recall at least one story in the news where the consumption of violent video games was blamed for somebody's violent behavior. This type of generalization has led to widespread public perception that video games can be a direct cause of violent behavior, even though there have been numerous studies that have found no causal relationship between video games and real-life aggression or violence. Yet, the idea that video games are harmful or just a waste of time continues to persist in the public perception. It denies the fact that video games and movies and television and music, these help us to process the world around us. in a way that's not too dissimilar to how children in generations that came before us did. Kids have been playing cops and robbers with guns made from tree branches for years. Make-believe during our youth is our way of experimenting with the world around us. It helps us to build the boundaries of right and wrong, to process our ideas of fairness and justice safely. Fake gunshot wounds don't bleed real blood, pretend brawls don't leave real bruises or scars, at least not ideally. A game based ultimately on immorality and resultant violence takes place within the realm of children's imagination. It allows them to experiment with different roles and situations in a safe and controlled environment. Video games do the same, but they make the intangibility of imagination tangible. Weapons are modeled now with near realistic detail. Gunshot wounds bleed blood. Fighting leaves visible scars, and it can escalate to something far more serious. It's no surprise that those unfamiliar with video games see them through a different lens. Video games have become so visceral that without context, someone walking past the TV might mistake them as uncivilized, completely lacking artistic or narrative merit. You know this if your parents ever caught you watching the loading screen for a Grand Theft Auto game. But you and I both know that couldn't be further from the truth. And while violence is present in some games, it isn't necessarily what makes a great game. A great game immerses you in itself. It leans on the same power of human imagination used in Cops and Robbers in order to transport you, the real you, into the digital world. Great games let you experience the lives of others. They can be tools of escapism, but also of empathy. To me, the proof of a true masterpiece, be it physical art or a movie or a video game, is its ability to make you forget where you are, sometimes even who you are. Games accomplish this in part from their visuals, yes, but also through sound and music and gripping storylines, even now through touch and the state of our bodies. Games put us in another person's shoes by overwhelming and confusing our senses, respectfully but convincingly. And so, immersion is this delicate walk across extraordinarily thin ice to keep us fooled. But for most people that haven't really played video games, and I'm not trying to gatekeep what it means to be a gamer here, but their experiences with gaming have never felt like this. The gateway drugs of games like Farmville and Candy Crush and Tetris even, don't feature the attention to detail seen in most games on PC or on console, and many mobile players tend to view games as a way simply to kill time, rather than to fulfill our needs for stories or escapism or socialization. It's what drives such a barrier between those who exclusively play mobile games and those who play mainline games. Hey, do you guys want to come over to my place? We could play some games? Yeah, sounds great. I'll bring some drinks. Yeah, and I'll bring some snacks or something. And I'll bring Candy Crush. Great, I'll see you guys there. These types of games have incredibly simple controls. They don't rely on years of having honed your reflexes or hand-eye coordination in order to be successful. Heck, I was 5 years old learning these skills while playing Tetris, and it only took me a few months to reach the game's credits. That's right, you can beat Tetris. These games are so popular because they now exist within the ecosystem of our cell phones, the device you carry with you everywhere and look at least several times a day. It's why the mobile gaming market is so huge. It can access a massive consumer base without asking players to ever change their daily habits or to learn new skills in order to play. Some mobile games have come a long way, yeah, but most continue to offer shallow experiences that can't begin to depict the incredible depth that games have accomplished. That doesn't mean we don't play these games for hours upon hours. We do. But it does mean that far more people are playing Honor of Kings on their cell phones than are experiencing Elden Ring. And that might be why games are still considered to be niche. It might seem like everybody plays games nowadays, but if the majority of those players are consuming shallow, time-killing experiences on their cell phones, then it starts to make a little bit more sense why public opinion is the way it is. Another issue is that access to games, real games as we know them, costs a lot of money. There's a big barrier to entry in order to be able to play a game like The Last of Us, or Halo, or Gears of War. You either need a console which costs several $100s and basically doesn't do anything other than play games, or you have to have a computer that's relatively souped up and has the specs to be able to handle modern gaming as we know it. But the other issue is awareness. A lot of people don't know what Steam is. A lot of people don't know that video game narratives have come so far in the last 20 years. Their knowledge about video games is kind of stuck in the past, and that's making it very difficult for us to move forward. Jump over to Steam and you'll find millions of other games. There is something there for everyone. Games that prove themselves not simply to be distractions for children or a means to kill time, but instead these beautifully interwoven pieces of visual, musical, and experiential art, and that deserve to be recognized publicly as such. The Grammys has recognized music made for fictional worlds for 65 years. Every year at the Grammys, we award composers and artists for their musical work made specifically for movies and TV. So why not video games? Why is it that we laud the soundtrack for the movie Interstellar, composed by the magnificent Hans Zimmer, yet not that of the recent indie simulation game Ixion, composed by Guillaume David? Well, partially that's because as of writing this, the Ixion soundtrack isn't available for a Grammy yet. It will be next year. But there's a greater history of video games at the Grammys that shows just how resistant the industry has been to include music from games. I've been a lifelong musician, and music, more than any force in my life, has driven me. Video game music especially has been such a huge part of who I am. So I was overjoyed to hear that the Grammy Awards introduced a category specifically for video game music in 2023. Overjoyed and really quite angry. Angry because it's taken over 25 years to give video game composers a place at the table. Angry for all of the amazing music written for video games in the past that will never be recognized. Angry because the music industry, a body that is arguably so closely connected to one of humanity's most important cultural expressions, has failed, like every other mainstream entity, to recognize that our love of video games is culturally relevant. We know that video games have featured incredible soundtracks for decades, some of which have been created and performed by TV and movie composers, fully fledged professional orchestras, rock bands. Music in video games is a big, booming business, but that's not all that it is. The music in games, just like the games themselves, are a beautiful art form. Take the 2011 game Bastion, for instance. The game takes place in the aftermath of the Calamity, a catastrophic event that literally rips reality apart. The result is both beautiful and harrowing. Husks of a fractured world float aimlessly in the black nothingness of space. And where life remains, it clings desperately to the scattered pieces of the past. You play as the Kid, a young boy tasked with piecing the Bastion back together and rescuing a few that survived this cataclysmic event. Your journey in Bastion is as much coming to terms with the tragic results of the Calamity as it is the realization that you may never have explored these places had the Calamity never occurred in the first place. The game's narrator takes every opportunity to paint the world's many changes, but this bittersweet existentialism and the persistent drive to survive the end of the world is conveyed most powerfully through the music in Bastion. Throughout the core of the game, a driving, grungy soundtrack almost pushes you forward. One particular track features a tempo that matches that of a march through a post-apocalyptic world, like something you might hear out of an episode of The Walking Dead. This is a game that hinges heavily on its characters, and depicts this both through the plot, which I will not spoil here, but also musically. The interwoven themes of Zaya and Zulf in the game are some of the last remaining remnants of their old lives. The songs each echo the character's desire to escape to a new world untouched by the Calamity, or to restore the old one and return to the loved ones they've left behind. These two songs are complementary of one another, musically and in the plot, and they represent how the characters' lives are now inextricable. Now, without context, The lyrics of Zaya's theme don't really make sense. They originate from a false history, one perhaps you could find parallels of in the construction of the Berlin Wall. But unlike all other music written in the year 2011, these songs have no real human cultural impact. They don't tell our story. They were written for the world of Bastion, a world that doesn't exist. And therein lies the key, I think, to the issue why video games aren't mainstream. As much as we wish the world would just wake up and play them, it's really on us to make that happen. It's on those of us who understand games to share our experiences and our love of video games and their worlds. I wasn't interested in the Game Boy originally, but someone put it in my hands, and they gave me the opportunity to become familiar with it, to eventually be able to recognize games for what they are: beautiful and complex works of art. To change the perception of video games by society, we need to become their advocates. There was a show called Sneak Previews that aired on PBS in Chicago, where I grew up. It was focused on reviewing various movies, but further, they spent time depicting movies as art. Their depiction of films had a sort of reverence for the delicate care given to creating them. And I was always engrossed by how they used language to express the emotions and the feelings that these stories evoke, without spoiling any of the important parts. I think the same can be done with video games. And before you say that we don't need television or radio anymore, I think we can use old mediums like these to bring stories to new audiences within the right context. So when will things change? When will we start talking about games the way that we do about movies or sports? When will we include game reviews in the columns of newspapers or as a segment of Sneak Previews on PBS? When will we finally get past the stigma of video games as a child's hobby and instead see them as meaningful and relevant artworks? Well, I'll tell you, it's when we do something about it. Each of us holds the capacity to affect change. All we need to do is take action. It's when we talk about video games with a broader audience, show them that games can be just as entertaining and meaningful as other forms of media. It's when we're sitting in the editor's seat deciding what content to include on the front page of the Sun-Times. It's when we're collecting the stories of the day and selecting what to air on the evening news. But you don't have to be in power to create change. It's when we show our parents or our grandparents a video like this one that shows them just how meaningful video games are in our lives and how artful they can be. It's when we persuade new people to just try playing a new game on their computer or on your console. It's when we put a Game Boy in the hands of someone who has never tried it before, and we set their lives on a new direction that they never would have anticipated.